I am going to begin this one in the early autumn of 1822, on a rutted northern road, still soft from 3 days of rain, with a proud man on a lathered horse cresting the last rise before the valley he had chosen as a grave. That is how I think of it, you know. A grave. Because that is what Lord Ridley Blackwell, the Earl of Crest Hollow, had intended when he sent his wife north 2 years before, to bury her in the most wretched, forgotten corner of his holdings, and let the world stop remembering she had ever existed. He had not put it to himself in those words, of course. Proud men seldom name what they do in its plainest form, but you and I may call it what it was. He was braced, as he made that last climb, for one thing above all others. He was braced for wreckage. He had sent his wife to Thornfield Reach, the northernmost and most ruinous of all his many properties, a half-drowned valley of exhausted timberland, and failing sawmills and tenant farmers who had been bled dry by generations of an absent landlord. He had chosen it precisely for its misery. He had expected, if he had let himself think on it at all, to find a woman dissolved by grief and isolation, the natural result of 2 years' exile in the worst place he had ever owned. He reached the top of the rise, and there was no wreckage anywhere to be seen. I want you to see it with him, my dears. I want you there on that muddy hilltop, your breath going out of you at the sight below, because what Lord Ridley Blackwell saw in that valley was not the drowned and dying ruin he had sent his wife to. The creek, the one that had flooded the lower fields every spring for as long as anyone could remember, had been channeled. Properly channeled, with new stonework bright and clean along its banks, directing the water away from the meadows and down into what appeared to be a mill race. A new one, the old sawmill that had stood derelict for 20 years, had been rebuilt. He could see the wheel turning from where he sat his horse, half a mile distant. He could hear at that distance the low, rhythmic sound of it working. The timberlands beyond the mill, those neglected, overcrowded, half-dead stands of spruce and pine and fir that had been choked with deadfall and disease when he had last troubled to think of them, had been thinned, properly thinned, in the systematic way that a person who actually understood woodland work understands it, not the careless hack and leave that bad managers do. The standing timber looked healthy. It looked like money. And the tenant farms, he barely recognized them. The tumble-down fences had been mended. The cottages had been re-roofed. There were kitchen gardens behind every one of them, productive ones, and children playing in yards that had been mud pits 2 years before. He sat his horse on that hilltop, and could not make a single piece of it fit the ruin he had expected. And then his eye found her. In the cleared field closest to the mill, a group of 12 men stood gathered, and at the center of them was a woman in a plain, dark riding habit. Her hat pushed back at the exact angle of a person who has been working hard and in weather, and has entirely stopped caring what she looks like. She was pointing at something in the tree line, directing, deciding, and the men around her were moving in immediate, willing response, the way men move for a person they would follow into a burning building. Not servile, devoted. Even at that distance, even after 2 years, he knew her. It was his wife. And I am going to stop us right there, my dears, right at that hilltop, with the Earl of Crest Hollow sitting frozen in his saddle above a valley he had meant as a punishment, looking down at a woman who was supposed to be quietly unraveling and was instead, plainly and entirely, running a kingdom. But you and I have our arrangement, and I mean to keep it. If you have not yet found the subscribe button for Moonlight at Bellwood, now is the moment. It costs you nothing and it takes 10 seconds, and it is the only way to make certain the next story finds you the moment I have it ready. There is always a next one. I tend to keep my promises. Now, before I let Lord Ridley ride down that hill, and down he must ride, into a reckoning he is not remotely prepared for, I must take you back. Back to a marriage arranged in a solicitor's office, and a woman whose whole life had been shaped for one thing and was given another entirely, and what she made of both. She was not born to be a countess. That is the seed of everything. so hold it carefully. Her name was Vera, and before she was anything grander, she was Vera Marchmont, the only daughter of a man named Isaac Marchmont, who had done what the born comfortable classes of England had spent a century assuming was impossible. He had made a vast fortune out of timber, honestly, by understanding wood the way a physician understands the body. Isaac Marchmont had been born the son of a sawyer in New Brunswick. You may understand now, my Canadian friends, why I have always loved this particular story, and he had crossed the Atlantic as a young man with a working knowledge of forest management that was, at that time, half a century ahead of anything the English timber trade had taught itself to do. He understood forest succession. He understood selective cutting and replanting, and the difference between a woodland managed for the long term and one being stripped for short profit. He understood how timber stands breathe and how they die, and how you bring a dying one back. He applied all of that to the neglected English timber lands that the old aristocracy had been mismanaging since before anyone alive could remember, and he bought them up cheap, ruined, exhausted, dying, and he restored them one after another and sold the timber from them at prices that reflected what they actually were when properly managed. He made a fortune that would have made a duke blink. And he had one child, a daughter, and Isaac Marchmont, who was a practical man before anything else, looked at his one child and his accumulated wisdom and asked himself the only sensible question available. Would he let that wisdom die with him because the child it must pass to happened to be a girl? He would not. He taught Vera everything. From the time she could walk the woods beside him, he taught her to read a forest the way he read it, to see not what was there but what it wanted to become, to feel the health or sickness of a stand of timber the way you feel the health of a person, instinctively and completely. By the time she was 22, Vera Marchmont could survey a ruined woodland and tell you precisely what it needed and what it would yield and what it was worth over the next 40 years. She could run a sawmill, manage its accounts, negotiate the contracts downstream. She could look at a failing timber operation and see beneath the failure the fortune it might be. It was the work of her life. It was the thing she had been made for. She asked the world for nothing more than to be allowed to go on doing it. And then her father died, leaving her everything: the fortune, the knowledge, the working timberlands, and the world she had never wanted came for her. Because a great fortune belonging to an unmarried young woman is a thing the comfortable classes cannot leave in peace. And the man who came for Vera Marchmont's fortune was the Earl of Cresthollow, who needed money badly, and whose pride was not, in the end, quite large enough to let him starve rather than take it. His ancient earldom was deep in debt. Generations of Blackwells had spent lavishly on everything except the maintenance of the estates that funded the spending. And Lord Ridley had inherited a title of considerable consequence, wrapped around a financial situation of considerable disaster. So the arrangement was made the way these arrangements are always made. A solicitor's office, 2 sets of lawyers, and a conversation in which Vera herself was the least consulted party of Vedensent. She was still in mourning for her father. She was alone in a way she had not yet learned to measure, and the Earl of Cresthollow was, at 32, not without a certain cold handsomeness that she might, in a different world, have found worth knowing. She consented, and I will be fair to her and say she knew what she was consenting to. A transaction, not a love match. She was not naive. But something in her hoped, as we all do, against the plainest evidence that a cold arrangement might yet warm. It did not warm. The Earl of Cresthollow installed his new wife in his great London house and his Wiltshire seat, and attended to her as a man attends to a piece of necessary but faintly embarrassing furniture. He used her fortune to begin settling his debts. This must be said plainly. And he used it immediately, and he looked down on her for having had it to use. He was ashamed of her birth. A timber merchant's daughter, a colonial timber merchant's daughter at that, who did not know the correct people or the correct forms, and who made the occasional error in a drawing room that his set noticed and catalogued and murmured about. He never corrected her cruelly, he corrected her coldly, which is worse because you cannot argue with cold. You can only absorb it and go quiet. He never once asked what she knew. It did not occur to him to ask. She was a countess now, and a countess had particular uses and a particular shape, and none of those uses required knowing anything about forest management in New Brunswick, the gift that her father had poured 40 years of wisdom into, the gift she had been raised and shaped and born to use. He did not know it existed, and he did not trouble to find out. Now I will tell you about Lady Serena Colquhoun, and I will keep it brief because women like Lady Serena Colquhoun do not deserve long introductions. She was elegant and well-born, and she had expected to be the Countess of Cresthollow. She had understood it as a settled thing, and when the Earl had instead married the timber merchant's daughter for her money, Lady Serena had smiled her loveliest smile, congratulated them both, gone home, and made a plan. She waited nearly a year. She was patient in the way that patient people with malicious intentions always are. What she constructed was a scandal. Assembled in the careful way a skilled carpenter builds something designed to look accidental. There was a young architect engaged to draw plans for improvements to the Wiltshire house. A perfectly ordinary young man, guilty of nothing, except being in the wrong position at the wrong time. Lady Serena arranged matters. A letter in a handwriting got up to resemble Vera's. A meeting managed to look like what it was not. A whisper placed in the right ear, and then another. And then the thing spread the way such things always spread, out of control and unstoppable, until every drawing room Vera had ever sat uncomfortably in was murmuring about the timber merchant's daughter, showing her low origins at last. It was a lie, every word of it. And Vera, when she understood what was being said, went to her husband. Of course she went to her husband. He was the one person in the world positioned to stop it, to stand beside her, to refuse the lie publicly, to use the name she had purchased with her father's fortune to protect the woman who had given it to him. She stood in front of him in the library of the Wiltshire house on a grey November afternoon, and she told him the truth. She told it plainly, without drama, looking him directly in the face. She told him what she knew of Lady Serena's motives. She told him the architect was innocent, and she was innocent, and that she was asking him, as her husband, bound before God to know her and stand for her, to believe her. And Lord Ridley Blackwell, the Earl of Cresthollow, did not believe her. I want you to sit with that a moment, my dears. Not the scandal, which was manufactured by someone who hated her. The scandal is Lady Serena's crime, and Lady Serena answers for it in the end. But the disbelief, that belongs to him. He heard his wife tell him the truth, and he chose not to trust it, because his pride had always thought the worst of her, and the lie arrived in convenient alignment with what his pride had already decided she was. He did not investigate. He did not weigh her word against her accusers. He looked at Vera, white-faced, steady, telling the truth, and he found it easier to believe she had disgraced him. He sent her away. To Thornfield Reach, the northernmost and most ruinous property in the Cresthollow holdings. He was precise about it. She was to go there and remain there out of sight and out of consequence. He did not shout. He explained it the way one explains an administrative decision, a relocation of resources to where they could do the least damage. He said he never wished to see her face again. She stood very straight through all of it, and when he had finished, she said only one thing. "You have spent our entire marriage not knowing what I am," she said. "You are going to find out now, and when you do, Lord Ridley, I think you will find you have made a very great mistake indeed." Then she went north. Thornfield Reach was everything the Earl had intended. Exhausted and half-drowned and forgotten, the manor house cold and badly kept. The tenant farmers sunk in the grey, defeated poverty of people who have been neglected so long they have stopped expecting anything different. Vera arrived in the last bitter days of November to a place that would have broken anyone, without a very particular set of skills and a very particular quality of will. For a few weeks, I will tell you honestly, it nearly broke her anyway. She sat in the cold house, and she grieved, for her ruined name, for the husband who had not thought her worth the trouble of the truth, for her father's absence at the exact moment his counsel would have meant everything. And then, one grey morning in January, she put on her heaviest boots and went out. She walked the timberlands. And Vera Marchmont, forgive me, she was Vera Blackwell by law, but she was Vera Marchmont in every particular that mattered, walked those exhausted, overcrowded, diseased and dying woodland stands with her father's eyes, and she saw beneath the ruin exactly what her father had taught her to see. She saw where the drainage wanted directing. She saw which stands were salvageable and which were past saving, and what should be planted in their place and in what order, and to what purpose. She saw a 40-year plan laid out in the contours of the land as clearly as if it had been drawn on paper. She saw, standing there in the January cold, with her boots soaking and her breath making clouds in the air, that the Earl of Cresthollow had made a mistake so spectacular she might almost have been grateful for it. He had meant to bury her. He had instead given her 900 acres of the one thing on earth she was a genius at managing. He had taken her out of the drawing rooms where she was useless and ornamental, and returned her to the woodland that was her native element, with no one above her, no fashionable contempt to navigate, and complete and total authority to act. He had given her, in his contempt, a broken kingdom and the absolute freedom to fix it. She went home and wrote to her father's solicitors, the ones who had, at her father's explicit insistence, arranged her marriage settlement, so that her personal inheritance remained in her name and under her control, protected by every legal instrument the old man's considerable shrewdness had known to arrange. Her money was hers. The Earl had received what the marriage settlement specified and no more. Vera had resources. Vera had knowledge. Vera had 900 acres of neglected woodland crying out for everything she knew. She went to work. I wish I could linger here, because this is my favorite part of any such story, the rising. She began with the drainage, because the waterlogged ground was killing the root systems of half the standing timber and making the rest prone to disease. She surveyed it herself, laid out the solution herself, and hired every man in the tenant farms who needed winter wages to dig it, paying them honestly and explaining to them what she was doing and why. This was not something the Cresthollow landlords had ever done. Explained themselves to their tenants. And the men of Thornfield Reach looked at her, the first week, with the flat, exhausted wariness of people who have been disappointed too many times to hope easily. She kept explaining anyway, and she kept showing up. That was the particular thing about Vera Marchmont, the thing her father had understood and the Earl had never troubled to discover. She did not manage from a distance. She walked the land with her people. She knew the name of every tenant farmer and every farmer's wife and every child who came to stare at the strange lady from the south who seemed to know things. When she introduced a new method of selective cutting, she did not send instructions by letter. She went into the timber, with her sleeves rolled up, and showed them herself. By spring, the drainage was done and the creek channeled. By summer, the first systematic clearing was underway, and the timber coming out of it was of a quality Thornfield Reach had not produced in 30 years, because it was coming from stands that were actually healthy. By the following spring, the old sawmill had been rebuilt. Vera had found the original plans in the manor house records, and it was running. By the second autumn, the tenant farms had new roofs and mended fences and sufficient firewood for the winter, and the children of Thornfield Reach were going to a small school that Vera had established in the old grain store. The people of Thornfield Reach, who had lived for generations in the grey, patient misery of the forgotten, began to use a phrase for her that was not her title. They called her Our Lady of the Woods. They meant it the way the old deep loyalty means things, without sentimentality and without limit. It was the accounts that moved first, as accounts always do. 2 years of careful management had transformed Thornfield Reach from a drain on the Crest Hollow finances into something the Earl's men of business had to look at twice, and then again, because the numbers were not possible for a property written off a decade ago. The timber revenues alone were remarkable. The mill contracts downstream were substantial. The tenant farms, now actually productive, were contributing rather than consuming. The Earl's men of business came to him baffled, and he made inquiries, and the inquiries came back with a story he could not credit. His exiled wife, whom he had sent north to be forgotten, had become the talk of improving landowners from 3 counties. Men came to study what she had done with the Thornfield timber stands. She was being cited in correspondence by name as a model of what informed woodland management could achieve. That alone might not have shifted him. Pride is a very heavy anchor. But the second thing arrived almost simultaneously, and the second thing shook the Earl of Crest Hollow in a way the financial reports had not. Because the truth about Lady Serena Colquhoun had, as truth eventually does, found its way into the light. One of the servants Lady Serena had paid to hold her silence 2 years before had since been dismissed for an unrelated grievance, and a dismissed servant nursing a grievance is a very specific kind of danger. She unloaded everything: the forged letter, the arranged meeting, the whole carefully constructed mechanism of a scandal built out of nothing by a woman who had wanted the Earl for herself and had not gotten him. The proof reached Lord Ridley in the early autumn of 1822. And the Earl of Crest Hollow sat in his library with the proof of his wife's innocence in his hands and understood, with a growing horror that had nowhere to go, the full size of what he had done. His wife had been innocent. She had told him so herself, standing in this very room, and he had not believed her. He had not even troubled to find out whether to believe her. He had sent an innocent woman, his own wife, to a northern wasteland for a crime she had never committed, because his pride had found it more convenient to believe she had. He could not sleep. A proud man's pride, once the first crack runs through it, lets in a flood. He rode north. He went braced for wreckage, as I told you at the beginning. He had prepared himself, as well as a man can prepare for the consequences of his own choices, to look upon a ruined woman and know that he had ruined her. He came over the last rise and looked down at Thornfield Reach. And I have already told you what he saw. Now I may let him ride down. The descent into the valley was, I think, the longest mile of Lord Ridley Blackwell's life. He passed the channeled creek and the new millwork. He passed tenant farms that bore no resemblance to the derelict hovels he had dispatched his wife to. He passed men, men working in the timber who did not take off their hats, who looked at him with the particular level assessment of people who have been taught their own worth by someone who actually knew what it was. They knew who he was. They did not trouble to pretend they were glad to see him. He found her at the mill. She was reviewing the week's cut with the miller, a ledger open in her hands, and she had heard his horse and turned before he was quite close enough to speak. 2 years had not changed her face. It had clarified it, somehow, as cold weather clarifies the air. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a problem she has already solved. "My Lord Crest Hollow," she said pleasantly when he had dismounted, "you are a long way from Wiltshire. I hope the roads were kind." It was exactly the right note to strike, composed, civil, and completely, devastatingly unbothered. The Earl had rehearsed 100 openings on the road north, and found that not one of them was adequate to the person standing in front of him. "Vera," he said, and then stopped. He looked around at the mill, the channeled water, the good timber stacked in the yard. "I came from the top of the rise," he said. "I saw all of this." "Yes," said Vera, "I expect it was rather a surprise." "I remember what this was," he said. "I chose it because I thought it the worst place I owned." "It was," she agreed. It also happened to be 900 acres of mixed timber land that had not been properly managed in 40 years. She tilted her head, and there was something in it that lived in the neighborhood of both amusement and contempt. My father spent his life turning exactly this kind of property into something worth having. You sent me here without knowing that. It was, as it turns out, the only generous thing you ever did me, and you did it entirely by mistake. He took that. He had earned it. I know the truth about Lady Serena Colquhoun, he said. I have the evidence, the letter, the arrangement, the servant's account. I know you were innocent, Vera. I know it completely. I know that you told me so yourself, and that I did not believe you, or rather, and he made himself say the accurate thing, because he had come this far, and the accurate thing was all that remained. I did not trouble to find out whether to believe you. I made the easier choice. It was not just. I know it was not just. I have come to tell you that I know it. She was quiet for a moment. You have come to tell me a great many things, she said. She closed the ledger. I am glad you know the truth. A clear name is not nothing, and I have wanted mine cleared, but, and now there was something steady and serious in her, nothing performative about it. That is not the wound. The scandal is Lady Serena's work. What is yours is that when it came you looked at your own wife, who had given you her father's money, and 3 years of patient effort, and the honest truth told directly to your face, and you chose not to trust her. Not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because you had never thought me worth the trouble of knowing. She let that rest between them. That, she said, is what you have come to answer for, not Lady Serena's lie, your own choosing. The Earl was quiet a moment. Then he stepped down from his stirrup. I think, perhaps, to do something with his hands, and perhaps also, because standing at her level seemed more honest than looking down from above it. I was raised, he said, to value the name above everything, the name and the standing and the appearance of the thing. My father made certain I understood that nothing, no person, no truth, no ordinary human obligation, outweighed the crest-hollow name. It is not an excuse. I know it is not. It is only the shape of the man I was when you married me, and I valued my name more than my wife, and my pride more than the truth, and it took me riding over that rise expecting a ruin, and finding a kingdom to undo what those choices had actually cost. He looked up at her. I did not come to collect you like a piece of property that has appreciated in value, he said. I came because I looked down from that hilltop and understood, for the first time completely, what I had thrown away. I came because I could not stay south, knowing what I know, and not come. He steadied his voice. There is nothing I can demand of you. I have no right to anything. But I can do one thing still, and I am asking your permission to do it. I will take the evidence of Lady Serena's scheme to London, and I will use it, not quietly, not in private correspondence, but publicly, in the places where your name was damaged. I will clear your name before everyone who whispered against it. Not so that you will return to me. I have no illusion you owe me that, but because it is owed to you regardless, and I should have paid it 2 years ago. And I will pay it now whether you send me away or not. Vera studied him for a long moment. You will clear my name, she said at last, publicly, completely before the season ends, and you will do this without condition, not as a bargain, but because it is simply what is owed. Those are not terms I am offering. That is a debt that exists whether I forgive you or not. Understood, said the Earl, and agreed. She nodded once. And then something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, not yet. It was too early for warmth, and she was too honest a woman to manufacture it, but a kind of considered possibility, like a forester looking at a clearing and deciding not that it is already forest, but that it might become one given time and the right conditions. There was a man, she said quietly, that I thought I glimpsed once, very early on, behind the cold manner, behind the name. Someone I might have been glad to know if knowing had been on offer. She studied him a moment longer. I should like to find out if that man has made it north. If he has, if he comes back here and learns this land on its own terms, with his sleeves rolled up, by his deeds, and not his standing, then we shall see what can be built from what remains of us. I will promise you nothing more than the chance. But the chance you may have, Lord Ridley, It is more than you came expecting, and rather more than you deserve. Only I find I am enough in myself now to be generous with things I can afford to give." He bowed his head. He accepted it as what it was, the greatest gift available to him, offered by a person who owed him nothing. He went back to London before the end of October, and he did precisely what he had promised. He laid the full account of Lady Serena Colquhoun's constructed scandal before the society that had whispered it, and he did it thoroughly and without softening. He stood up and declared his wife innocent, wronged, and the finest practical mind he had encountered in any room he had ever entered. Lady Serena Colquhoun left London shortly afterward, and was not much missed. And then Lord Ridley Blackwell, the Earl of Cresthollow, came back to Thornfield Reach. He stayed. He learned the timber under Vera's instruction, the patient, demanding, sometimes humbling instruction of a woman who knew it better than anyone alive, and was not inclined to make concessions to his dignity while she was teaching him. He learned which stands were to be cut this season, and which were to be left for 10 years, and why, and he found he had a better mind for the long view than he had given himself credit for, which Vera acknowledged without ceremony, and built on without sentiment. He learned the names of the tenant farmers and their families. He walked the land in all weathers, with his sleeves rolled up, and found that the land, met honestly, gave back something he had not known he was missing. He was, once the pride had burned through him, a capable man. Vera had glimpsed it once, long ago, and she had not been wrong. They came to something. I will not rush it by calling it love too quickly. They came to a partnership first, an honest one, built from the working day out. The partnership had time to deepen, and it deepened into respect, and the respect had time to warm, and it warmed into the kind of feeling that is not the sudden falling sort, but the kind that has to be built, beam by beam, out of shared work and shared weather, and the accumulated evidence of a person revealed completely by how they act when things are hard. They had in the end a true marriage, freely chosen, between two people who knew exactly who the other was. And Lord Ridley Blackwell, who had spent his whole life measuring everything by the Cresthollow name, lived to be prouder of his wife than of every ancestor in the family portraits, and to know himself for exactly what he was. The most fortunate kind of fool who had buried his greatest fortune in the place he thought of as punishment, and whose wife had turned it into the finest thing the Blackwell name would ever be attached to. If you ask me what this story is truly about, my dear listeners, I will tell you this. It is about the difference between a name and a worth. Lord Ridley had a name, ancient, considerable, the kind that opens rooms, and he mistook it for worth, the way men of inherited consequence so often do. Vera had a worth, the deep, specific, hard-earned kind that her father had given her, and that no title or circumstance or manufactured scandal could take away, and she had no name at all, not in the beginning, not in any form that drawing-rooms chose to count. He was an earl by inheritance, she was a master by knowledge, and when the ruin he planted her in bloomed under her hands, when the proof of her was simply there, 900 acres of it, undeniable in the autumn light, it broke his certainty and gave him, eventually, the better thing. You cannot banish a person who carries their knowledge inside them. You may put them in the worst place you own, and they will study it and understand it and make it magnificent and call it home. The place does not diminish them, they illuminate the place. You have sat with me tonight, through a cold marriage and a bitter exile, and the making of a kingdom in the northern timberlands, and I am glad you were at the other end of this fire for it, if it has given you something to carry, some warmth, some particular and private certainty, that what you know, truly know, cannot be taken from you, then I would ask you, before you go, to subscribe to Moonlight at Bellwood. There is always a next story, and the next one is already waiting, and I should not like you to miss it. It costs you nothing, and I, like all patient people, remember who has not yet kept their end of the arrangement. Come back to me, my dears, beneath the soft light of the evening star, where every worth is earned and every ending is deserved. Good night. And if ever the world should try to send you somewhere, it thinks you will be forgotten, learn the land. There is no telling what you might raise from it.